Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another video. Welcome into the video. Today we are going to be talking about the top 5 worst flaws that RPG games have. These are not going to be ranked in any order. The bottom line is that all 5 of these flaws are massive flaws that games can have, and they're all really bad for an RPG game to have. Alright, so starting off the list, we have our first major flaw in RPG games, and that is a really slow beginning of the game where nothing really exciting happens. The game takes forever to get started, and the beginning of the game starts very slow and is very, very boring at the beginning of the game. First impressions are very important when it comes to playing games or watching movies or meeting new people and that type of stuff. And when you begin a new game and the first impression of the game is that it's moving very slow, nothing exciting is happening, and you're having to watch back-to-back non-stop tutorials, constant story scenes, you're barely getting into any battles, and there's nothing really exciting going on in the game, that is not a good first impression for a game. A game needs to get started fast. It needs to be exciting right from the beginning. Having a very slow start is not a good way to introduce a player to a game, and a lot of RPG games actually have this flaw. This is a very big flaw with a fair amount of RPG games out there. In some RPG games out there, it's so incredibly bad that in the first hour of the game, you only get like one battle the entire time, and the rest of the first hour of the game is walking around, talking to people, watching tutorials, and having nothing really go on in the game. That is something I really like about Super Nintendo era RPGs, is that those games knew they had to be exciting right from the beginning. Those games got started really quick, and they were exciting right from the beginning. And for some reason, with more recent RPG games, developers just seem to have this idea that having the slow start to the game where nothing really exciting happens is a good idea, and they really need to get rid of that idea. They really need to make sure the game starts off exciting and fun right from the beginning, and that the beginning of the game isn't very boring. Developers really need to avoid making this mistake with RPG games. Okay, now we're moving on to the next biggest flaw that RPG games tend to have. This is points of no return in the game with no warning, where you can end up saving your file, and then if you can't beat a boss or get past that part of the game, you have to start the entire game over from the beginning again. This happened to me a few times, especially when I was a kid. One game in particular, Final Fantasy Tactics, one of my favorite PlayStation 1 RPG games. There's a part in that game where you gotta do this solo 1v1 boss fight with the main character Ramza against a boss, and the game gives you a chance to save before then. Now, being a kid, I didn't know any better at the time, so I went ahead and saved, and then I fought the boss, and I couldn't beat the boss no matter what I did. I just didn't have the right setup, I didn't have my character built the right way, and because of that, I couldn't get past that part of the game, and there's no option to go back and level up or change your setup or really anything like that. So because of that, I had to start the entire game of Final Fantasy Tactics over again. This is another really huge flaw RPG games have, and developers really need to make sure that their RPG games don't have a flaw like this. If there is a part in the game that is a point of no return, make sure you warn the player, let them know, and let them know that, hey, if you save past this point, you can't go back and level up. You can't go back to the store, buy new equipment or items. Make sure you let the player know ahead of time that they're at a point of no return if they save here. The next major flaw RPG games have is mandatory minigames, especially if the minigames are really bad. For example, maybe the controls aren't good, or the minigame is super annoying, or it's just not fun to do at all. The PS1 era had a lot of this. It had a lot of forced minigames in RPGs. Sometimes the minigames can be a lot of fun, but other times they can be absolutely horrible. And that's another thing to keep out of RPG games. Keep minigames optional, or don't put them in RPGs at all. Okay, now we're moving on to the fourth biggest flaw that RPG games tend to have sometimes. The fourth biggest flaw that RPG games tend to have is that even if the player severely outlevels the enemy and the enemy no longer gives good EXP or money and is super easy for the player to defeat, they'll still have the player either get chased by that enemy as they're moving through an area, or they'll force the player into random battles against that enemy where they get barely any experience or money from defeating that enemy. we have constant battles against even weak enemies. So in games where you have to backtrack to a previous area where the monsters are now really weak, they barely give any EXP or money that's worth it, and they're not worth fighting overall, the game developers will still design the game in a way that either through random encounters you still get in battles with them and have to fight them or run from them, or if it's an RPG game where there's no random battles, the enemies still run after you and try to chase after you and get into battles with you, even though you're like 10, 20, or 30 levels above them, and fighting them is a complete waste of time. If you severely outlevel enemies in an area, you should either instantly win a battle if you get into the battle with those enemies and skip the battle entirely, kind of like how Earthbound on the Super Nintendo, which was genius, did it, where if you were over leveled and you fought a weak enemy, you just skip the battle and you immediately won. Either that, or make it so that the enemies don't chase after you and you can just walk right past them and get through the dungeon and grab whatever it is you need to get, or travel through the area really quick and be done with the area and not wasting time fighting battles against enemies that are super weak, who give really low EXP and money for that point in the game. The fifth biggest flaw that RPG games tend to have is permanently missable items or permanently missable side quests. In my opinion, side quests should not be permanently missable, especially if it leads to a secret character, a secret item that's really cool, or a really cool story cutscene that further develops the characters and the world of the game. There shouldn't be permanently missable stuff in the game, and I don't know why game developers always put this in RPGs. They should allow the player a chance to go back and get something if they missed it earlier in the game. What ends up happening is that if you put permanently missable stuff in a game and somebody misses it by accident, that means that person has to start an entire playthrough of the game over again once they finish their current playthrough, and that can be a huge deal, especially if it's a very long RPG game. RPGs tend to be some of the longest games out there in terms of game length for a single player game. And for even just the main story, skipping all side quests, some RPGs can be 30, 40, or even over 50 hours just for the main story. So having to start an entire playthrough over again because you missed something that is permanently missable is just really silly. Game developers really need to stop doing this with RPGs, and they really need to allow the player a chance to go back and get that thing that they missed earlier in the game. Overall, that's going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching my video on the top 5 biggest flaws in RPGs. I want to say thank you so much for making it to the end. And if you are new to the channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I would really greatly appreciate it. Also, check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/Shockstorm, where I do full game playthroughs of single player games, mostly RPGs, which I then review and talk about here on the YouTube channel. Go onto the Twitch channel, give me a follow there. Either way, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Everyone have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Have a good one, everybody.